comfort, especially at this difficult time in their lives, Lord, and the loss of Kurt. Pray that you would be with them, Lord, and help them. Give them strength, Lord, but most importantly, Lord, give them the hope of the resurrection of eternity, Lord, and your promises. We pray, Lord, that you'd be with Brian Dodson as he continues to struggle with COVID, and you'd help him, Lord, to overcome that and to win that battle, Lord. And we pray that you would be with Yul in his cancer and the treatment that's upcoming for him, Lord, that would be successful, that be with Billy also, Lord, and strengthen her and give her some peace, Lord, in her heart and mind. I pray that you would be with Gaffman family, Lord, Nick, and his family that's here, and you put your healing hand upon that young man, Lord, and bring him back to his health, that you'd help him to respond favorably to the things being done, and that you give his family some peace and hope, Lord, in your healing. We just pray, Lord, that you be with Earl as he comes home, and that you would help him, Lord, better and to enjoy, Lord, and get back to enjoy himself, and be with Margaret especially as she has to take care of him. Lord, we just pray that you put your blessing on that family, Lord, and the long struggle that they've had, that you would help them, Lord, through that. Pray be with others, Lord, that have been mentioned, that are on our hearts and our minds this morning, Lord, that you would bless them, Lord, in ways that we don't even understand. Pray that you would fill their lives with goodness and with hope and with strength, Lord, and that you bless those here this morning. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We, he's been to Felix, right? He's been to Festus, and he's going to send him on to Rome because that was what he requested, to go before Caesar. So that has to be done, and he's not wasting a lot of time with this. And he's going to put him on a ship, and he's going to send him to Rome. So pretty good journey, and a lot of travel there. Most of it by sea. We'll go through this deal, and Luke will kind of play that out, how that works, and in the issues with that voyage. And that's like, once again, I said, we're really in a real historical part of the Bible in Acts. And Luke is an historian. Luke's very historical about what he puts forth. So it's not real theological. It's not real, not a lot of that stuff you go to when your life's in turmoil. But it's important for us to understand, and it's good that we have it. It gives a lot of credibility to the Bible, credibility to Scriptures, credibility to Paul, his travels as they were recorded, and there's things here also that have actually converted people, believe it or not, in this particular chapter of the Bible. So, and I have a story for that. So so there's stuff here that helps us, and it was quite the voyage, wasn't it? Quite a ways across the Mediterranean. Major storm is going to cause big problems. So that was a big deal. Going to wind up at Malta. We'll talk about that. Off course, going to kind of blow them off course. So against the urging of Paul, I might add. So there's a lot of things going on here. Paul will eventually get to Crete after his imprisonment. He'll get to Crete, actually be there and actually establish a church there. So he's not done yet, as you might say. He's not done yet, even though he's on his way to Rome. Sail for Italy. So there's other prisoners. We don't know who those were. Probably other Romans, I would assume, going to Rome, making the same journey. And they gave him over to this, as they says here, a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. So he seems to be a decent chap. He's going to give Paul some leeway, and they're going to set sail. So he's going to, Paul's going to get to make this voyage on Rome's nickel, right? I mean, he's not going to have to pay for this. That's one thing about him appealing to Caesar. Rome's going to have to pay for his journey to Rome. So that's kind of good for Paul. He's kind of going to get to make this. I imagine sea travel in those days was quite treacherous. It's a little bit treacherous today, but I can only imagine how it would be in those days. I often try to imagine that, actually. As a kid, I read a lot of sailing books. I always thought I should have grown up on a sailing ship somewhere in my life, but I never did. But I always kind of felt that call, I guess. It's always something that's been big to me is the water. And I've read a lot of books on that, and a lot of old-time sailing books. And you know, it was very treacherous in those days. It didn't have what we have today. It didn't have the Coast Guard and ship-to-shore radios and you know, GPS and navigation, and you know, none of that existed, right? They did it by the stars. If it was cloudy and storms, you couldn't fix your position. You didn't know where you were. They didn't have lighthouses. They didn't have anything to help you. So it would be terrifying. I think the guys that set out in a ship and sailed across the ocean, regardless of what you might think about them, I think it was either foolhardy or very brave, right? One or the other. But it was a big thing. You know, we talk about Columbus. We'll get a lot of flack about that these days. Sailing to America, or those early explorers that, you know, when most people still thought the world was flat, and they set out across the ocean to go find something, and people thought they would sail off the end of the world. That'd be a little bit scary. Bible stories about the storms, the sea, Jesus on the storm. You know, I think that story in our mind is maybe hard to picture how terrifying that storm was when Jesus came to them on the water and Peter was in the boat. You know, I've played that story out 1,000 times in my head, and I just don't know that we could understand, you know, how terrifying that was in a small boat and water coming over and seeing Jesus and thinking he was a spirit. And you know, like I said, I've played that story 1,000 times in my mind, it's one of those. I think if I could experience a biblical story, well, no, the raising of Lazarus would be pretty hard to pass up, wouldn't it? But I think the storm on the sea with Peter would be one of those stories that I would like to get to see that. I would like to get to see that story. I think that would be an amazing, amazing event. You know, Paul's in this situation. He's taking off on this ship. They're paying. This is a paid passenger thing. Rome's paying for their voyage, for their fare. Put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. That doesn't necessarily mean a lot to us, but it probably did to them. And I think that's something that Luke throws in there. It's like a historical reference. Means probably something to them. That man probably meant something to them more than it does to us, so Luke wouldn't have put it in there. He writes this letter to Theophilus, the beginning of Acts, most excellent Theophilus. And some people think the name Theophilus means lover of God, and some people think that he wrote it to all lovers of God, and some people think that it was a specific Theophilus was just the guy's name, and I believe that. I think it was a specific person. I really don't think it was a general letter sent to all lovers of God. I think it was written to this guy, Theophilus. So Paul, obviously, this guy might have meant something to Theophilus, might have been a reference. It's historical, and in historical books, historical documents, you want to make historical references. I used to read a lot of Louis L'Amour when I was a young kid too, and you know, he grew up not too far from where I was raised. Or didn't grow up, but he lived not too far from where I was raised. He lived down around Gunnison and had a big ranch there. And one thing in his books he always said, you know, is that every time I say there's a spring or a mountain or a creek, he says those things actually exist. You know, I write about it in my book, but those places actually are real. And I always thought that was kind of fascinating about Louis L'Amour books. But it's kind of that way with historical things. You want points of reference, people, times, dates. And what you got to remember here as you read the Bible is that they didn't have, you know, our calendar, the Julian calendar, didn't come along until centuries after the Bible. They didn't have our calendar. You know, we use a Julian calendar. So, and that didn't exist until a long time after, what, 3rd century, something like that. I'd have to look that up. I can't remember. Before the Julian calendar actually came into existence, our calendar came into existence. So they couldn't say, like we would say in historical books, you know, May 19th, 1973 or whatever. That's just a random date, by the way. But they didn't have that. They didn't have that ability. They couldn't say this date. So they fixed things, fixed points in history by people. You see that throughout the Bible. This was when, so-and-so was ruling, and so-and-so was king, and so-and-so was the procreator, and so-and-so was, that's how they dated it. So when we try to go back in the Bible and reconstruct dates, after the feast, we'll see that. This was after the feast. That was a big mile marker in Judaism, right? The Feast of Passover, that was a big yearly event. And we see that in the life of Jesus, This was a Passover. That's why he marked the life of Christ by Passovers, number of Passovers. So, we go back historically then, we go back and we backtrack our calendar by fixing these dates in our history, and we put a date on that. But they didn't have that ability. So when they would reference things, it would be by people, most of the time by people. Who was in power? Who was ruling? Who was where? Who was doing what? That was how they made those frames of reference. And Luke, of course, does that more than anybody else. Even during the birth of Christ, we see that. Herod the Great, that's a fixed point in history. We know when Herod the Great lived, and we know when he died. So Herod the Great's a real fixed point, in historical framework. So these kings that ruled, these people that sat, even Pilate. We know when Pilate was procreator in Jerusalem. We know about Felix. We know about Drusilla. We know about Bernice. We know about the Agrippas. We know about all these different people. So it gives us an historical framework to build this story around, and that's exactly what's going on here. We put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care, which we would assume would be people of the church. So the first place they go here is Sidon. So it's not a very big journey. We're in Caesarea. That's where Paul's being held, north of Jerusalem. That's where Paul's being held. And then we're going to go, this little short journey to Sidon, and Paul's going to receive care, probably from the church. That's close enough. They probably knew about Paul. He'd been there for 2 years in Caesarea. He had been in Antioch, which is, on up the coast from there. That's where he left on his missionary journeys. He undoubtedly had been through there as he traveled from Jerusalem. So probably members of the church there that he found and that were able to receive care from them, to minister him to there. And I don't know, I've kind of pondered that this morning a little bit. What did that mean to receive care? Was he ill? Was he sick? Was that his thorn in the flesh that he talked about that was giving him trouble? Did they give him extra provisions to go on his journey? Things. Did they give him a goodie bag, right? Homemade cookies and stuff for his journey? I don't know. But he received care of some sort from them, and I think Luke put that in there because that was what they did for him, and that was their benevolence to him and their blessing to him. And from there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. So this is really, according to what I read, this is real late in the year. So instead of going straight across from Sidon to Myra, which would probably be the best way, instead of doing that, because of the weather, because of the time of year, because it was starting to get past the time of year that they sailed, they went up around the island of Cyprus. That's real interesting that Luke put stuff like that in there because it gives credibility to this text and to the story, the legitimacy of this story. So they went up around Cyprus. They stayed in this smaller body of water to keep away from those waves and away from that wind as they were making this journey. And we sailed through the course of Cilicia and Pamphylia. We landed at Myra in Lycia, where the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. So, this is a change of ships, change of venue. The centurion is trying to get all these prisoners to Rome. He has to find a way to get them there, find somebody that will take them. So that's what he does, and they get on this ship, setting sail. I've done a lot of talking. Any comments? Trying to give you all I got about this. So they're going to change the ship, going to change the venue. They sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty. These ships are not real good about sailing into wind. They're not real good about sailing in bad weather. That technology really hadn't evolved by this point. And I know some maritime, I've read some stuff from some maritime scholars, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit, and about the ships of this time, the ships of this era, and how they were rigged and how they sailed and a lot of things that went on with them. And, this is one thing that's going to be a problem. These ships are really laden with cargo because that's their money, that's their job, just like, so this ship is heavily laden. It has a lot of cargo on it. It has people on it. It has stuff on it. It has everything on it. This is just a hodgepodge of stuff on this ship. So this ship is maybe overloaded even at that, possibly really, really heavy. So they're really fighting to get this ship into the wind. So it's taking them a lot of days to travel, a lot more than it should have, because this wind is against them. The difficulty, it says, since the wind did not permit us to go further. Like I said, that just has to do with the technology of the day and the ships of the day. And we sailed under the shelter of Crete. So, they're not going to land here. So this isn't when Paul goes to Crete. Paul hasn't actually been to Crete, I don't believe, by this time. That'll happen after this Roman imprisonment. But they're going to they're going to sail along Crete because and they're going to, I guess they will land in Fair Havens, and they're going. But I don't believe this is when he establishes anything. But they're sailing along this because they should have just went across, but they can't. You see, because the wind. The only thing they can do is go down. So they got to go down. So they wind up at Crete, and that also gives a little credence to the idea that this is beyond the time that they should go. So we're moving along on this, and with difficulty sailing past, getting to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over. See, once again, train, point of reference. It's past the fast, right? What is the fast in Judaism? Not the feast. This is the fast. The fast is what day? Only one day in Judaism, God required them to fast. Only one day of the year. There was a required fast. Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. And Yom Kippur is when? Just had it, right? Just had it. Yom Kippur's in the fall, late in the fall. So Yom Kippur just passed, I believe. So I think it was in earlier this month, right? Just the other day. So it's really late in the year. We're getting towards winter. Got to remember, this area of the world is in the northern hemisphere too, just like we are, right? This isn't southern hemisphere. This is northern hemisphere. We're in the northern hemisphere. So what that means is that our winter is their winter, and our summer is their summer. So when we talk about times a year, when you talk about the fast, talk about Yom Kippur in September. Now, September, that would be when it was there. So this is getting towards the end of their good weather. This is towards the end of the year. So that's the reason that Luke throws that in there. Even the fast was already over. So he's giving you a reference. Yeah. Yom Kippur, I cannot tell you. That's a Hebrew, I believe. It's the Day of Atonement. Is that actually what that means? Do you know, Yom Kippur? I technically don't know what that term means. Somebody could probably Google it. I don't know, but it means Day of Atonement. Okay, Lilu's got it. Thank the Lord for Google, right? Google knows everything. It used to be when we have a conversation and we would like wonder something, like I wonder about that, and now we don't wonder anymore. I think our wonder is gone because somebody says, "Oh, look that up." Sometimes you want to say, "Oh, just don't. Let's just wonder about it. It's okay to wonder. We don't need to know." But Day of Atonement. Right, it'd be evening to evening fast. That was the only actual required fast under the law, was that day. So the Jews fasted a lot. 4 major fasts by the time of Christ. 4 major fasts by the time of Jesus. But the only requirement of the law was Day of Atonement. That was it, that day. Everything else in Judaism was a feast, not a fast. Everything else was a feast. Let's have a feast, right? The Feast of Booths. Yeah, that's right. The Feast of Booths. The Passover was a feast, not a fast. So all these others were feast days. Feast of the first fruits, right? An ingathering, Feast of Booths. So all these were days of feasting. But then the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was day of fast. So, but what happened is, by the time of Christ, the Jews had banned all those fasts on everybody. So they had made it where if you didn't fast on them other days, that was a sin. That was against God. Even though really the only true fast was that one day. That kind of gives you an idea of how oral law had influenced that Judaism by the time of Jesus. Paul began to admonish them. Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there as somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So they're actually going to try to go to another harbor of Crete, is where they're going to try to get on the other side of the island. Basically, they're wanting to get where they can winter. They're wanting to get in the lee of the island where they can winter. So that was their plan. But Paul, of course, had a little better knowledge. And they didn't, of course, listen to him. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing they had attained their purpose. Once again, this is the day before weather forecasts and all that, so they just had to go by their feeling, their gut feeling, I guess, or maybe indications they could see around them. The old adage, right? Sunset in morning, sailors take warning. Sunset at night, sailors delight, right? Yeah, red sky. Those old things we used to do. My grandmother used to talk about that. Cows all facing the fence, and persimmon somethings, fork spoons or knives or something in persimmon. I don't know. Even I wouldn't know persimmon seed if it hit me in the head. So it doesn't do me any good. Yeah, I wouldn't know persimmon seed if it hit me in the head, much less if it had a knife, a spoon, or fork inside of it, or whatever it is. So I don't know, but I was thinking, as I think about this, I always think old Junior Bailey. Most of y'all knew Junior when he grew up around here as a child. Grew up here, and years ago he said he went to school. They used to ride horses to school. They'd ride their horses to school, and he says, you never had a forecast or anything. And he says, boy, a couple times they'd ride to school and they'd come out and the snow would be blowing and the wind would be howling and everything else. They didn't have a clue when they went. So you got hung out. So we don't take all that for granted today. But back then, of course, some of you, I'm sure, remember the days. I don't. But when you really didn't have accurate forecasts, but they didn't know. They just had to take it as a sign. They took a majority vote, and they decided that, okay, let's go. We're going to make this. But they rushed down from the land a violent wind called the Euraquilio, which is not what they call that today, and I don't really even know if that's Aramaic or what language that is for sure. But when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, and like I said, that was the deal. That's what happened to these ships. They couldn't really sail into the wind. So at that point, they're kind of at the mercy of just letting it, of just going. So what they would do is they would, running under the shelter of a small island called Claudia, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. And they hoisted it up, and they used supporting cables and undergirding the ship, fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis. They let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. So what they did is they took these ropes, and they would pass them underneath the boat. These are wooden ships, obviously. And what they would do is they would take these ropes. They said cables, but it was ropes. They would take these ropes and they would put them underneath the hull of the ship, and they would bind them on the top and tighten them. And those ropes would bind the ship, would hold it together. They'd run them ropes. They'd undergird it with these ropes. interestingly story here, I think there's an interesting story, is there was a guy, we used to have a preacher here. Oh my gosh, I can't remember his name. Anyway, Gerald Calden. We used to have a preacher here, Gerald Calden, and Gerald knew a guy um, that he was a archaeologist or a ship guy, some sort of a ship, whatever you call that. But anyway, he always doubted the Bible and the authenticity of the scriptures because he said, well, he said the Bible can't be right because, I'm a historian of this, and in those days, the first century, he says they didn't undergird ships. They didn't know to do that yet, and they didn't undergird ships like that when they were in a storm. And anyway, in an archaeological dig, they about that time, several years ago, whatever, they dug up one of these ships and they unearthed it, and it was undergirded with ropes. And this guy actually converted to Christianity because of this weird statement in the Bible that none of us probably think anything about. But to him, that was the defining moment where he decided that this was all true. I mean, that was the pivotal thing that made him decide everything was true. So you never know how words, phrases, things, affect people. I remember I baptized a guy one time years ago, and really what converted him to Christ was the fact that after the crucifixion, and it's something I guess I never really thought about that much, but after the crucifixion, the graves were open, and the saints appeared to many. Remember that passage? I kind of always kind of read over that. I guess I knew Jesus, but you think about the graves being open and all those and people appearing, and that idea that in there is really what converted him to Christ. So you never know how people are going to see something and it's going to trigger something in them to think, oh, this makes sense now. And it doesn't always we don't think like everybody else thinks. So sometimes these little things become important. And then what they did was they would take these sails and they would tie them off. And of course, the ship is being just driven by the wind. And if you've ever been on a boat, that's never really good because you get broadside to the waves and you can capsize you and fill your boat with water. So what they would do is they would take these pieces of sail and they would put ropes on them and they would throw them over the back of the boat and tie them to the stern of the boat. And what that would do is it would, or to the bow of the boat usually, and then what that would do is those would drag and keep the boat into the wave. So the waves wouldn't capsize the boat. That's what a sea anchor is. And I used to use those a lot because if you couldn't go into the wind, that would slow you down because you didn't just want to run from the wind, because if you did that, you didn't know where you were going, right? So you could run into a piece of land. So the idea is let's put the sea anchors out, put the ship into the wind on these sea anchors, and then let's, to slow us down and hope the wind changes and we can get back going where we need to go. It just buys time. So that's what they were doing. They were buying time. Very big storm. They were being violently storm tossed, and they began jettisoning the cargo. So like I said, the ship was probably overloaded. I mean, more cargo, more money. So, I mean, this is a for-profit vessel. So, it probably had a lot of cargo. And so now they're starting to lighten the ship. They want to get some weight off of it so it can ride these waves. So at this point, they're not worried. This tells you how severe it is. They're not worried about the money anymore. They're worried about living. They're worried about survival. The money is not important. So we're throwing the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. There's a lot of speculation about what that means, but a lot of people that I've read, ship people, they say that probably what they were doing at this point is the big crossbars on the mast that held the sails. They were probably throwing those over, trying to lighten the ship. So at this point, they had even given up now on saving the ship. I mean, they were just basically trying to save their lives. They're taking everything off here they can to save themselves, right? And I guess if it comes to your life or everything that you own, you're going to take your life, right? So the rest of it's kind of irrelevant by this point in history. I always think of that show, the guy that Uh, stole all the money, got on the airplane, jumped out. Huh? Yeah, JB. Yeah, DB Cooper. Yeah, DB Cooper. I watched a show on him one time at a movie. You know, of course I don't know what happened to him, but it showed him actually landing in the snow, and he was trying to burn the money to try to stay warm. I'll never forget that. Uh, anyway, just stuck with me. But when it comes down to your life or your stuff, you're going to take your life, and that's what the situation was here. On the third day, they threw the tackle overboard with their own hands. Neither sun nor stars appeared, and the reason he says that is because that's the only way they had to navigate, right? They had to be able to use the sun and the stars. That's how they fix their position. And since the sun and the stars didn't appear for many days, they're just on the ocean. So, you know, they don't know. They don't know what they're going to hit. They don't know where they're going. They don't know what they're going to run into. So they're scared, right? You would be scared. I would be scared. Very scared. Matter of fact, they're not even eating, he says, not even eating. And he says, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail for Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you. So Paul's had a vision. An angel of God stood before him and gave him this vision. And he says, you know, nobody's going to die. There won't be any loss of life. Do not be afraid. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sitting with you. So God's going to spare them. So he's telling him, you know, this is all going to end up all right. You're all going to live. You're going to lose the ship, but you're all going to live because I've had this vision. So Paul's had this vision. Paul puts that. He says, take up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I've been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. But when the 14th night came, as you were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. So there's ways you know that. By the waves, as you get in shallower water, the waves push up more. There's things sailors know to see that. So they're surmising that they're getting close to land. And so that, of course, is a worrisome thing to them. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. So, you know, they took a piece of line with a piece of lead on it, and they would pitch those out. They had knots on the line, and every knot would be a fathom. And so they would pitch these sounding lines out, and when it hit the bottom, they would grab the line and they would reel it in, and they would count the knots, and that's how they would do that. And they would, that's how come ship speed is in knots instead of in miles per hour, because that's how they did that. They tied knots on a line and so many knots. So that's how they did speed. Anyway, so they found to learn about sailing this morning, then you want to know. But anyway, that's what they did. They found it to be 15, so it's coming up. Fearing they might run aground, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. So, you know, they're casting out these anchors. They're going to try to stop the ship now. They're going to try to stop the ship. But, of course, that's not always a good thing because the waves are still pounding it, and once you stop it, that puts a lot of strain on it, so the ship will start breaking apart. They were trying to escape from the ship. They let down the ship's boat. So this is the small boat they have on the ship, and they let it down on the pretense of letting out bow anchors, but that wasn't what they were doing. That was a pretense. What they were going to do is they were going to abandon all the prisoners and everybody on the ship, and they were going to sail to land and let everybody else die. Right? That was their plan. Sacrifice the prisoners. Several years ago, there was a tornado come through right by the shop, and we had it probably been 10, 15, I don't know, a long time ago anyway. But we, by chance, we had a Greyhound prison bus, a big prison bus full of maximum security inmates in the yard of the shop getting a tire fixed. And these guys were all in cages and shackled and chained to the floor. And this tornado was like coming right for the shop. And we're like telling them, the tornado was coming right for the shop. And the guards on the prison bus called the highway patrol, told them there was a tornado coming. They had a bus load of max security prisoners, but they wouldn't let them off. They left them shackled in the bus. I often think of that when I think of this story. They left them all chained and shackled in the bus with a tornado coming and ripped the roof off a couple of buildings out there. I mean, they survived it, but I've often thought about that. You know, they just left them on the bus, shackled to the bus. So Kind of the same thing here. So sacrifice the prisoners. We're going to get it. But then Paul said, unless these men remain on the ship, you cannot be saved. And this centurion apparently had come to know Paul, to trust Paul. The soldiers cut away the ropes, not the sailors. So the centurion had these soldiers with him to keep the prisoners, and they cut the ropes loose and let the little ship fall into the water so nobody could use it. So now they're all in the same boat. Fun. So now they're all in the same boat, right? And where's Shannon at? Oh, she's not here. She'd like that. That's just her kind of fun. Until the day was about to dawn, and Paul was encouraging them to take some food. Today is the 14th day. You've been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing, he says. I encourage you to take some food. He took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all. I love that. I love that part. That's a good part. Even in the middle of the storm and the ship and the waves and the wind, and Paul's taking time to say grace, right? Paul's my kind of guy. So Paul's taking time to say grace, gives thanks in the presence of them all. They were encouraged and they took food. And there are 276 people on this ship. So that's not a small ship, right? I mean, we often think, well, it's these small boats, but this is a good-sized vessel. 276 people and cargo. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. So there's some stuff I guess they hadn't thrown out yet. So they're going to finish that off. And when day came, they could not recognize the land, but they saw a beach. They thought maybe they could drive the ship on the beach. They're casting off their anchors. They left them in the sea, so they just cut the anchors loose and let the ship go. They didn't even try to save the anchors. They were trying to guide the ship into the right place, but it didn't happen. They struck a reef where two seas met, and they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would sail away. Real reminiscent of what we see in Acts with Peter when the Philippian jailer wanted to kill himself, because that would have been his punishment if the prisoners had escaped. So they're not going to let them escape. They don't want to die. So their plan is just to kill him. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention, commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard and get to land. The rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things in the ship. And so it happened that, as God said, they were all brought safely to land. So, we look at stories like this. Like I said, not great theological debate, but real historical, interesting story, part of Paul's journey. And, of course, we'll pick up on that Sunday morning, about out of the book of Acts. He'll soon be at Rome in custody of the Romans. So, but I hope you enjoyed this morning, and hope maybe we got something out of it anyhow. Thanks for your time this morning.